The obsolete technology the world still depends on. The story of the pager. You probably haven't thought about a pager in 20 years. You might not have ever owned one. But for a specific window of time, roughly 15 years centered on the 1990s, the pager was the most important device in a person's pocket. Doctors lived and died by it. Executives wore it like a badge. Teenagers clipped it to their waistbands because their favourite rappers did. At its peak, 61 million of them were in use across the world. Then cell phones arrived, and within 5 years, it was over. Except it wasn't. The pager never actually died. It retreated into the walls of hospitals, emergency services, and military units, places where the things that replaced it still can't fully be trusted. And it found an entirely unexpected second life on the host stands of restaurants around the world. To understand how it survived, you have to go back to where it began. On a steamboat crossing Lake Erie, with a 9-year-old boy who had no business being where he was. His name was Alfred Gross. Born in Toronto in 1918 and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. When he was 9 years old, his family crossed Lake Erie on a steamboat. While exploring the ship, Gross found the radio room and the operator let him in. He watched messages leave the vessel and arrive from nowhere, signals travelling through open air, invisible and immediate. He was transfixed. When he arrived home, he built a radio from junkyard parts. By 12, he understood how receivers worked. By 16, he had his amateur operator's license. By his early 20s, he was inventing devices that would define how the world communicated for the next 100 years. In 1938, working out of a basement in Cleveland, Gross built what would become the walkie-talkie, a handheld two-way radio that could transmit and receive without wires, without a fixed base station, without a room full of equipment. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, saw a demonstration and immediately brought him in. During World War II, Gross ran a covert program called Joan Eleanor, a two-way ground-to-air radio system that allowed OSS agents operating behind enemy lines to communicate with high-altitude aircraft without their transmissions being intercepted. The frequencies he used were too high for standard enemy receivers to detect. After the war, Gross shifted his attention to civilian life. He lobbied the FCC successfully in 1948 to carve out a segment of the radio spectrum for personal two-way communication, the spectrum that would eventually become citizens' band radio. And in 1949, he invented something the world would take the longest to catch up with: the telephone pager. The concept was simple: a small portable receiver linked to a telephone network that could be triggered by a phone call to alert the person carrying it, and the understanding that someone, somewhere, needed you. The device itself was unglamorous. It was a pocket-sized metal box, no screen, no keypad, no display of any kind, housing a radio receiver and a small circuit that could distinguish a signal meant for it specifically from the noise of everything else in the air. When the right signal arrived, it beeped. That was the entire feature set. It weighed roughly 6 ounces. Crude by design, functional by necessity, the look of it was never the point. The point was that it worked. The mechanics were straightforward. When someone needed to reach a physician, they called a central operator, who then transmitted a coded radio signal over a specific frequency. Every pager on the network received that transmission, but only the one with the matching circuit would respond to it. That selective response was Gross's key invention: discriminating circuitry that filtered out every signal except its own. When the right code arrived, the circuit closed and the device beeped. The entire chain, telephone call to radio signal to pocket receiver to audible tone, happened in seconds. He licensed the technology to the Jewish Hospital of New York. In 1950, physicians there began carrying the first operational pager system in history. For the first time, a doctor could be anywhere in the building and still be reachable. Gross tried to sell the idea further. He attended a medical conference in Philadelphia to demonstrate what the device could do. The response was tepid. Many doctors said they didn't want to be reachable during their leisure time. Others worried it would disturb patients. He was, as it turned out, decades ahead of his time. His patents covered not just the pager, but foundational technology in cordless telephones and cellular communication. Those patents expired in 1971. By the time the world was ready for what he had built, Gross owned none of it anymore. He died in Sun City, Arizona, in December 2000, the same year the pager industry hit its peak of 61 million users worldwide. He was 82. The Lemelson MIT Prize, one of the most prestigious awards in American invention, was presented to him posthumously. The tragedy of Alfred Gross is that he succeeded completely, just on a timeline that left him on the wrong side of the patent clock. The world he invented arrived exactly as he said it would. He simply couldn't afford to wait for it. Alfred Gross invented the pager. Motorola built the industry. Motorola was founded in 1928 in Chicago, Illinois. By the time the pager became viable, the company had already been in the wireless communications business for 3 decades. They had built the radio systems that equipped US Army infantry in World War II. They had put two-way radios in police cars and fire trucks across America. They understood, better than anyone, how to manufacture portable radio hardware at scale. In 1959, Motorola formally coined the term pager and released the first mass-market version of the device. The underlying principle was the same one Gross had patented a decade earlier, a portable receiver that responded to a specific radio signal. What Motorola brought was not a new idea, it was the manufacturing scale, the distribution network, and the commercial infrastructure to put that idea into the hands of the world. The man responsible for the engineering breakthrough that made it viable was John Francis Mitchell. Mitchell was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1928, the son of Irish immigrants. He studied electrical engineering at the Illinois Institute of Technology and joined Motorola in the early 1950s. By 1960, he had combined elements of Motorola's existing walkie-talkie technology with automobile radio engineering to produce the first transistorized pager, a version compact and efficient enough to be worn comfortably on the body throughout a full working day. Transistors replaced vacuum tubes. That single change made all the difference. Vacuum tubes were fragile, ran hot, and drained a battery quickly, making the device bulky and impractical for a full day of wear. Transistors were smaller, more durable, and drew a fraction of the power. Before the transistor, the pager was a promising idea trapped in impractical hardware. After it, the pager didn't just have a future, it had an industry. In 1964, Motorola released the Pageboy 1, the first consumer tone-only pager brought to the mass market. It had no display, it couldn't store a message. When it received a signal, it beeped, once, twice, or in a pattern that the carrier had been trained to interpret. A physician with a Pageboy 1 knew exactly what a double beep meant. Go directly to the emergency department. The information was encoded in the tone itself. The Pageboy 1 established Motorola's dominance of a market they would control for nearly 4 decades. Through the 1970s, the technology evolved. Tone and voice pagers arrived. After the alert tone, the device relayed a short audio message. Code blue in the ICU. Call the operator. The recipient no longer had to decode patterns. They received the information directly. By the late 1970s, alphanumeric pagers were in development. Devices with small LCD screens capable of displaying numbers and, eventually, text. Mitchell rose through Motorola's ranks during all of this. He became the company's chief engineer, then its president and chief operating officer. He was also one of the key figures behind Motorola's cellular phone program, the team that produced the first commercial handheld mobile phone in 1973. The device that would eventually kill the pager was, in part, built by the same man who made the pager viable. Mitchell died in June 2009 in Palatine, Illinois. The technology he pioneered had by then already reshaped the world twice. Two things happened in the 1980s that turned the pager from a professional tool used by hospitals and emergency services into a device that 60 million people around the world would carry. The first was wide area paging. Early pagers only worked within a few miles of a single transmitter. Useful inside a hospital, almost useless across a city. In the 1980s, paging networks began linking transmitters together across entire metropolitan areas, then across states, then across entire countries. A single page sent from a landline in Chicago could now reach a pager in a suburb 50 miles away. The range problem, the fundamental barrier to mass adoption, had been broken. The second was the numeric display. Original pagers just beeped. The addition of a small LCD screen changed the entire transaction. Now the message could carry a phone number, the one to call back. Alphanumeric pagers arrived in the mid-1980s, capable of displaying short text messages, though it wasn't until around 1990, with devices like the Motorola Advisor, that they became widely adopted. The device had evolved from a simple alert into a rudimentary messaging system. Subscriptions exploded. From 3.2 million users in 1980 to 22 million by 1990 to over 61 million by 1994. The three largest markets were the United States, Japan, and China, each building a different relationship with the same device. In China, the market was run largely through provincial subsidiaries of China Telecom, which controlled around 80% of a paging network that had grown to become the largest in the world by the late 1990s. At its peak, China was adding 5 million new paging subscribers in 1998 alone. The device spread well beyond the major cities. While mobile phones remained concentrated in urban centres, pagers reached deep into smaller cities and rural areas where mobile infrastructure hadn't yet arrived. In 1998, China's Ministry of Information Industry projected 90 million pager users by the year 2000. It was an optimistic target, and one the market never reached. Mobile phones began overtaking pagers in China's largest cities that same year, and as mobile infrastructure expanded rapidly after 2000, the pager market was cut short before the projection could be realized. China wasn't just a large pager market, it was the largest pager market on Earth. In Japan, the story was different in ways nobody anticipated. And in the United States, the market was building an infrastructure nobody had seen before. In Japan, NTT held the dominant operator position, a story worth returning to. And in the United States, Motorola still dominated hardware, controlling 85% of the American market at its peak, while a new wave of network companies were building the infrastructure that made nationwide paging possible. Paging Network Inc., known as PageNet, founded in 1981 and headquartered in Plano, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, became the largest wireless messaging company in the world by subscriber count, eventually surpassing 10 million active pagers and $1 billion in annual revenue. They built a nationwide transmitter network with more coverage points than any competitor. SkyTel, originally a subsidiary of MTEL Communications, occupied the premium end of the market. They built a high-capacity nationwide alphanumeric paging network and targeted business professionals. SkyTel subscribers received text messages, not just numbers, a distinction that mattered enormously to executives who needed real information, not just a number to call back. Meanwhile, Japan was developing its own pager culture, entirely separate from the American trajectory, and in some ways more interesting. Nippon Telegraph and Telephone, known as NTT, Japan's largest telecommunications company and the rough equivalent of what AT&T was to the United States, had introduced pager service in Japan in 1968, over a decade before the American market took off. For the first 2 decades, pagers in Japan followed the same pattern as everywhere else: a professional tool carried by doctors and salaried businessmen, used for urgent operational communication. Then, in the early 1990s, something unexpected happened. Teenage girls adopted the device. In Japan, pagers were called pocket bell, poketo-beru, and the name itself signals how the culture received them differently. These weren't tools for emergency medicine. They were objects of communication, connection, and coded intimacy. The reason teenage girls latched onto them is specific and worth understanding. Japanese homes in the early 1990s typically had one shared telephone. Private phone calls were impossible. Your parents, your siblings, anyone in the household could hear every word. The pager solved that. A message sent to a pager arrived silently, read only by the person holding the device. For a teenager who wanted to communicate with friends or a romantic interest without the entire household listening, the pocket bell was the first private communication channel they had ever owned. But the device could only display numbers, not words, not characters, just digits. So Japanese teenagers invented a language. They developed an elaborate system of numeric codes based on goro awase, a form of Japanese wordplay where numbers are mapped to syllables based on how they sound in Japanese. The number 1 sounds like E. The number 4 can sound like yo. Put them together and you get syllables. Stack the syllables and you get words. Stack the words and you get sentences. I love you became 14106. Good morning became 084. Good night was 0833. See you later was 3470. There were hundreds of standardized codes, catalogued in dedicated codebooks that sold at stationery shops across the country. Teenagers carried these codebooks the way previous generations carried dictionaries. To send a message, you went to a public payphone, dialed the recipient's pocket bell number, then punched in the numeric code. Your friend's pager beeped. They looked at the number sequence on the screen. They decoded it. At break times in schools across Japan, queues of students formed outside payphones, not to make calls, to punch in numbers. The line was the social network. The payphone was the server. By the time NTT Docomo released updated pocket bell models that could display basic Japanese characters, katakana, the codes had evolved even further. A phone icon on screen meant "call me." A heart meant what hearts have always meant. Teenagers were inventing text message culture years before anyone built text messaging into a mobile phone. At the peak in 1996, Japan had more than 10 million pocket bell subscribers. Cultural anthropologist Mizuko Ito later described the pocket bell as the first viral youth technology, a device whose intended users had nothing to do with the people who actually transformed it. Nippon Electric Company, known as NEC, Japan's electronics giant, became the dominant hardware manufacturer in the Asian market, producing pocket bells in increasingly compact and colourful designs that out-engineered Motorola's offerings on form factor and appealed specifically to the youth market. Multiple colours, smaller bodies, designs that could clip to a school bag. Japan's pocket bell culture became the direct precursor to mobile internet adoption. The teenagers who grew up communicating in numeric codes were primed for the keitai, the mobile internet phone, when it arrived in the late 1990s. They already understood that a small device in your pocket could carry meaning. They had built that understanding themselves, out of numbers and payphones and codebooks from a stationery shop. Back in the United States, The pager had become a cultural object that no one had predicted. Doctors and executives wore it on their belt as a mark of seniority, the device that meant someone needed you urgently and you were the person worth reaching. Drug dealers adopted it for obvious operational reasons. A pager left no outgoing call record, required no verified name to register, and gave the recipient complete control over whether to respond or not. And then hip-hop culture absorbed it. Rappers wore pagers in videos. Their fans did the same. By the mid-1990s, the beeper was a high school fashion accessory, clipped to jeans, attached to backpacks, sometimes carried purely for the aesthetic of it. The pager was everywhere, and then the thing that was supposed to replace it arrived. Cell phones had existed since the early 1980s. They were large, expensive, and unreliable. They were not competition for the pager. By the mid-1990s, that had changed. Cell phones were getting smaller, networks were expanding, prices were dropping, and critically, they could do the one thing the pager never could. They could send a response. The pager's core limitation had always been its one-way architecture. You received the alert, you then had to find a way to call back. Every page required a second transaction. The cell phone eliminated that second transaction entirely. You received a call, you answered it. You sent a message, you received one. The entire back and forth happened on one device in your pocket. The pager industry saw it coming and tried to adapt. In 1995, Motorola released the Tango, the world's first commercial two-way pager. It could receive text messages and email and reply with a standard preset response. It could be connected to a computer to download longer messages. It was Motorola's attempt to add the one thing the pager had always been missing. In 1996, a small Canadian company called Research in Motion, known as RIM, based in Waterloo, Ontario, went further. It had been building wireless data devices since the late 1980s, largely invisible outside of niche enterprise markets. Their interactive pager changed that. It had a full keyboard, a graphical display. It could send and receive messages freely, not just respond from a preset menu. It was, effectively, email in your pocket. RIM's interactive pager became the foundation for what would eventually become the BlackBerry, the device that saved the two-way messaging concept, while simultaneously proving that the pager as a hardware category had been superseded. Unlike the pager it replaced, the BlackBerry ran entirely on cellular infrastructure, dependent on the same networks, the same towers, and the same points of failure that the pager had been built to avoid. For most users, it was an upgrade. For the hospitals, fire stations, and emergency services that needed a signal that never went down, it was no replacement at all. The numbers tell the rest of the story clearly. US pager subscribers peaked at around 61 million in 1998. By 2000, the number had fallen to 37 million, a drop of nearly 40% in just 2 years. In 2001, Motorola and Glenair, the two dominant paging equipment manufacturers, both began exiting the pager space. In 2002, Motorola stopped manufacturing and servicing pagers altogether. The company that had coined the word, built the first consumer device, dominated the market for 40 years, and controlled 85% of American pager sales, walked away. PageNet, the largest paging network operator in the world at its peak, spent nearly $1 billion trying to build a next-generation two-way network in the late 1990s. The products they developed with Motorola failed. The network never reached its targets. The company collapsed as the one-way paging market it had been built on evaporated beneath it. Japan's pocket bell culture lasted slightly longer than the American market. NTT shut down its last pager service in 2007, more than a decade after the peak. The teenagers who had built an entire coded language out of numeric pager messages had already moved on. They had become the first generation of mobile internet users, and they brought the habits the pocket bell had given them with them. The device that had once been everywhere now had only one direction left to go: into specific rooms in specific buildings, carried by specific people for specific reasons. The argument for keeping the pager sounds counterintuitive until you understand what it's actually designed to survive. Pagers don't use cellular networks. They operate on dedicated paging frequencies, low-band radio signals that penetrate concrete, steel, and the thick interior walls of large buildings more reliably than any cellular signal does. They work inside elevator shafts, basement radiology suites, and hospital wings that are effectively dead zones for smartphones. During a mass casualty event, exactly the moment when emergency communication matters most, cellular networks are the first thing to congest. Every person in the vicinity is calling, texting, checking in. Emergency responders are competing for bandwidth, with thousands of civilians doing the same thing simultaneously. The infrastructure wasn't built for that volume. It saturates and slows, sometimes failing entirely at the precise moment it is needed most. Paging networks don't have that problem. They were never designed to carry two-way voice traffic or data. They broadcast in one direction only. A lean, low-bandwidth signal that requires almost nothing from the network to deliver. When a cellular tower is overwhelmed and dropping calls, the paging transmitter next to it is still sending. The signal still gets through. The pager still beeps. And the hardware is absurd in its durability. A pager battery lasts weeks, sometimes a month or two on a single charge. No app updates, no operating system vulnerabilities. It was built for people who couldn't afford for it to stop working. This is why, by the time the rest of the world had abandoned pagers entirely, the people who needed them most never stopped using them. This is why the NHS, the National Health Service, the United Kingdom's publicly funded healthcare system, was still using them. As of 2023, Freedom of Information requests found approximately 79,000 pagers still in active use across NHS trusts in England. At the peak of pager use in the 1990s, the NHS was running over 130,000 devices. The gradual reduction was not a rejection of the technology. It was a slow, careful transition driven by one question that proved harder to answer than anyone expected. What do you replace it with that works as well, everywhere, every time? Replacing the pager turned out to be harder than it looked. Smartphones offered more: two-way messaging, patient record integration, encrypted calls. But more features meant more dependencies, more signals needed, more batteries to charge, more ways to fail at the wrong moment. The pager had none of those problems. It beeped when it was supposed to. In a building full of concrete and interference, on a shift with no room for error, that was enough. It stayed. Spock, the largest wireless paging carrier in the United States, published a 2023 report titled The State of Healthcare Communications, which found that 81% of respondents still used pagers at their organizations for secure communication, with reliability cited as the primary reason ahead of any other factor. The military and government use case runs on different logic entirely. Pagers carry no GPS, no Bluetooth, no internet connection. They cannot be used to track a person's location the way a smartphone can, passively, continuously, without the carrier's knowledge. In environments where operational security matters, that invisibility has real value. Nuclear facilities across the United States still route alerts through paging networks. Defense contractors use them. On-alert military personnel carry them because the paging infrastructure is hardened in ways that commercial cellular networks are not, built to stay up when everything else is being disrupted. For fire departments, the case is straightforward. When an emergency call comes in, pagers deliver the dispatch alert, address, nature of the emergency, instructions, to every responder simultaneously on a dedicated public safety frequency that civilian traffic never touches. Volunteer firefighters rely on them almost exclusively. carrying them off-duty around the clock. No app to open, no notification to dismiss, no signal to find. Just the alert arriving the moment it is sent. The restaurant industry found its own use for the pager and never really let it go. In 1993, long-range systems introduced the coaster call, a palm-sized pager shaped like a drink coaster. High-volume restaurant chains quickly adopted them, allowing customers to wander nearby instead of waiting in crowded lobbies. When a table was ready, the host simply pressed a transmitter, causing the pager to buzz, flash, and light up. The waiting line became almost invisible. 3 decades later, coaster pagers remain common on restaurant host stands around the world. While many restaurants now offer text message notifications, countless establishments still rely on the familiar buzzing coaster pager. The paging companies that survived the consolidation of the early 2000s became critical infrastructure providers. USA Mobility, formed in 2004 from the merger of Arch Wireless and Metrocall, the 2 largest remaining independent paging operators in the United States, and Spock, which grew out of USA Mobility after it acquired Amcom Software in 2011 and rebranded in 2014. Today, Spock serves more than 2,200 hospitals across the United States. 9 out of 10 children's hospitals named to the 2024 to 2025 US News and World Report Best Children's Hospitals Honor Roll use Spock for clinical communications. As of July 2025, 18 of the 20 adult hospitals on the same publication's Best Hospital Honor Roll do too. More than 125,000 organizations worldwide rely on its paging and communications networks. These companies don't make consumer products, they run networks. They sell reliability as a service to the institutions that cannot afford to lose contact with their people at the worst possible moment. There's a pattern in the history of technology that the pager reveals better than almost anything else. The device that wins the consumer market is not always a device that wins where the stakes are highest. Alfred Gross proved the idea could work. Motorola turned it into a product. John Francis Mitchell helped make it small enough to carry. PageNet and SkyTel built the networks that connected millions. Then Research in Motion transformed the two-way pager into the BlackBerry, making the device it evolved from seem obsolete to almost everyone. And yet, across more than half a century of innovation, the essential idea never changed. A signal is sent, a device receives it, someone knows they're needed. We often think technological progress is a straight line, that every new invention replaces the one before it. But history is rarely that simple. Most technologies don't disappear because they stop working. They disappear because most people stop needing what they do best. The pager never stopped solving its problem. It simply became a tool for the people who could never afford failure. That's why, in some of the most important places in the modern world, it never really went away. The people who still carry one can't afford not to. This channel is about systems. The ones that were built decades ago and still run everything. The ones being built right now that nobody is watching closely enough. We will cover them, one at a time, the same way we covered this one. Thank you for watching.